As the Second World War is coming to a close, the winners, which it looks like it will be the Allies, are going to have to decide what's going to happen with the world after the war. They begin this process of diplomacy way back in 1943. The first diplomatic meetings happened in Tehran, which is the capital of Iran, and we have all three leaders coming together to meet. Now, all three leaders had their own sort of styles. Churchill really believed that a dinner party was the best way to accomplish these negotiations. People would have a couple drinks, they'd be relaxed, and they'd be more willing to cooperate on their terms. In general, these three leaders, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, are trying to coordinate their military efforts because, for the most part, the military efforts have been very separate. There was the Eastern Front and Stalin fighting Hitler on the Russian front. There has been sort of in North Africa, that was the British and the Americans. And in the Pacific, it has been the British and Americans as well. It's decided that there should be a second European front by 1944. Stalin was asking for this, saying, I'm the only one fighting the Nazis in Europe, and I can't handle the full force of the German army. I need you, the other allies, to sort of open up a second front and divide German efforts. They meet again in February of 1945 in Yalta, which is a sort of a seaside resort located on the Crimean Peninsula. The biggest topic of discussion there is, what are we going to do with Germany when the war ends? Because by 1945, both sides have entered into German territory, and it's just a matter of time before Germany is forced to surrender. It is decided that to help Germany rebuild, but also to keep an eye on her, that the Allied countries will each sort of get a section of Germany to oversee. So we'll end up with the US, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and even France will be given a territory of Germany to oversee. This is to make sure that it does rebuild, and not to sort of punish Germany like what had happened following the First World War. One thing that is discussed and is agreed upon but won't actually happen is the British and Americans ask Stalin if he will join the war in the Pacific. The British and the Americans had been fighting against the Japanese, and they were running out of steam. They needed some backup. So they sort of almost begged Stalin to help them fight. If this war hasn't ended by the end of summer, then we're going to need Russian help in the Pacific. Then, once the war in Europe is done, they need to come up with a few more specifics. So they do that at Potsdam, which is just outside of Berlin. Same countries, but different people. We'll start with America. President Franklin Roosevelt had died. He had been ill for quite some time, and so his vice president, Harry Truman, takes over. We still have Stalin. And then we have Clement Attlee, the new British Prime Minister. When the war was over, Britain holds elections, as they hadn't for so long because of the war. Churchill, the man who had led the British people through the war, through a few harsh policies, rationing, sort of that sense of the stiff upper lip that the British have. He looked to a future after the war where the people would pull themselves up by the bootstraps. The British people were exhausted, and they wanted more help from the government. They wanted more services provided, and that's what Clement Attlee's party offered. So the man who led Britain through the war is not re-elected, and Clement Attlee takes his place. The biggest thing decided at the Potsdam Conference is what to do with Berlin. We've talked about the capital cities being very symbolic. Berlin is in the heart of the Soviet-controlled part of Germany, but they decide to divide the city itself just because it is so symbolic. And we see here East and West Berlin. All of this will lead to some of our topics in the Cold War. The other major thing is Stalin is rewarded with Eastern Europe. Remember, he argued that his disabling of Germany at Stalingrad and on the Eastern Front was so significant that the Allies would not have won the war without Stalin's efforts. And his consolation prize, his goodie bag, is this territory. Now we look at all of this, these territories that had been controlled and conquered by the Nazis, now conquered and controlled by another dictator. Now, why would the Allies do this? Why would they agree to this? Well, even though Russia, Britain, and America were allies, they were truly frenemies. Britain and America had no love for Stalin, but at the time, they all had a common enemy in Hitler. Now that Germany has been eliminated, there is tension between the Soviet Union and the West.
We know that the war in Europe ends May 8th of 1945, but the issue is that the war in the Pacific against Japan is still continuing. And we talked about the Pacific Theater and the Banzai attacks and the kamikaze attacks, that we really saw that the Japanese mentality, both of the military and the civilians, was to fight to the death. And that's why it was so important that the Manhattan Project had been started several years earlier. You'll remember that the first atomic bomb that was tested was known as the Gadget. Now, that was tested in July of 1945. And one of the things that President Truman discusses with Stalin at the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945 is that America had just tested this. In a sense, he is trying to tell Stalin that America has firepower. And so what looks like might be a complicated relationship between these allies who are in fact enemies, Truman is trying to display American power. Thing was, Stalin already knew because of Russian spies. Other than the Gadget, the other two bombs that are created are the Little Boy. That's the first one. Little Boy is put on the bomber plane, the Enola Gay. It flies over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Here you see Hiroshima. It is dropped, and it is sort of suggested by the American government that we don't want this war to continue, but we see no choice unless Japan surrenders. Japan, even seeing how horrific the damage was from this bomb, decide not to surrender. And so the second bomb was called the Fat Man, and it is on the Boxcar plane, and it is dropped over Nagasaki on August 9th of 1945. And there's the Fat Man. Finally, with the dropping of this second bomb, Japan has to come to terms with the fact that they just simply are not cut out to continue fighting against war at this level. So we have the beginning of the atomic age, and Japan formally surrenders on August 15th, 1945, which we know as VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day. And of course, the most famous photograph is of this in Times Square. Now, technically, the war is over, but the documents have not been signed. And that won't happen until the following month on the USS Missouri. If you can pick out in the picture, General MacArthur is there to sign the documents. Remember, he had said he shall return to his troops in the Philippines. And the USS Missouri was one of the boats that was not seriously damaged in the Pearl Harbor attacks. And with this, as of August 15th, 1945, World War II is entirely over.